Chapter 1. The Most Dangerous Man in America. There was a time when Frederick Douglass was the most famous black man on earth, and one of the most dangerous in the eyes of those who profited from slavery. He had stood on platforms from Massachusetts to Scotland and told a story that the slave-holding South desperately did not want told his own. He had described, in precise and devastating detail, the beatings, the hunger, the deliberate crushing of the mind that slavery required to survive. And he had described something else too, the fact that he, a man the law still counted as property, had taught himself to read, had outwitted his captors, and had walked free. By the time he was 30, Frederick Douglass had published a memoir that sold tens of thousands of copies, launched a newspaper, shared a stage with the greatest reformers of the age, and met presidents. He had done it all starting from nothing, from a one-room cabin on a Maryland plantation, from a childhood without a recorded birthday, without a father he could name, without a single thing the world agreed was his. This is the story of how he did it. Chapter 2. Born on Tuckahoe Creek. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery around 1818, the month and day unrecorded, as enslavers rarely bothered. He later chose February 14 as his birthday because his mother had called him her Valentine. He came into the world on Tuckahoe Creek in Talbot County, on Maryland's eastern shore, in a small cabin home to his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, a woman of quiet resourcefulness who raised several grandchildren while their parents were hired out to distant farms. Frederick never knew his father. Rumor and his own later account pointed to a white man, possibly his enslaver, but he could not say for certain. He knew his mother, Harriet Bailey, only as a distant figure hired out a dozen miles away. She could visit only after dark, walking the whole distance on foot to sit by his side before dawn took her back. She died when Frederick was about 7. He was not permitted to grieve publicly. He was, in the eyes of the law, a piece of property, and property did not mourn. Yet from those first years beside his grandmother, watching the creek and the birds and the wide Maryland sky, something in him remained stubbornly, irrepressibly alive. Chapter 3. Sent to Baltimore. When Frederick was about 7 or 8, his enslavers sent him to Baltimore to serve as a houseboy for the family of Hugh Auld. In the logic of the slave system, it was simply a transfer of property, but for Frederick it was, in hindsight, a turning point. Baltimore was a city of nearly 100,000 people, with a sizable free black community, busy wharves, and ideas in the air. He later called it the best thing that could have happened to him. Hugh Auld's wife, Sophia, a woman new to slaveholding and not yet hardened by it, began teaching the boy his letters, pointing at words as she read them aloud. Frederick absorbed everything with speed and joy. The lessons did not last. Hugh Auld discovered them and forbade them at once, declaring with unintended clarity that education would make any enslaved person impossible to control. He was not wrong. The forbidden thing became more precious than ever. As Frederick later recalled, from that moment he understood the path from slavery to freedom. Hugh Auld had tried to close a door. In doing so, he had shown Frederick precisely where it was. Chapter 4. The Secret School of the Streets. Without Sophia, Auld's lessons, Frederick improvised. He persuaded white boys he met on Baltimore's streets to teach him words, offering bread in exchange for spelling. He studied letters chalked on timber at the shipyard, learning the marks carpenters used to sort planks, S for starboard, L for larboard, and building them into an alphabet. He found a copy of the Columbian Orator at a market, and bought it with carefully begged and saved coins. Inside were speeches and dialogues, including a fictionalized exchange in which an enslaved man argues, calmly and irrefutably, for his own freedom. Douglass read it until he had it memorized. He practiced writing by tracing the shapes in Hugh Auld's discarded copybooks. Slowly, and then rapidly, he assembled literacy, the very thing his enslavers had identified as the danger they must prevent. By his early teens, he could read newspapers, political pamphlets, and the Bible with full comprehension. He read about abolitionists. He read about men who believed slavery was a crime against God and nature. Each word he learned made the cage around him more visible, and his resolve to leave it stronger. Knowledge and the desire for freedom grew together, inseparable. Chapter 5. Covey and the Breaking Point. Around 1833, Frederick was sent back to the Eastern Shore and hired out to Edward Covey, a farmer known locally as a slave breaker, a man who specialized in whipping the resistance out of enslaved people. The year with Covey was the worst of Frederick's life. Way. He was beaten regularly, worked from before dawn to after dark, in all weathers, underfed, and exhausted. He later wrote that Covey had nearly succeeded. His spirit was crushed, his love of learning extinguished, his sense of self ground down to almost nothing. Then, in the summer of 1834, Frederick was approximately 16. Covey came at him again. Something shifted. Frederick did not run. He turned and fought back, seizing Covey by the throat and holding him off for nearly 2 hours until the man gave up. Covey never raised a hand to him again. "I was a changed being after that fight," Douglass would write years later. He was not free. He was still enslaved, still subject to sale and punishment by others. But something essential had been reclaimed. He knew now that he would rather die than remain what they were trying to make him. The road to escape was still 4 years away. The decision was already made. Chapter 6. The Plan. By the late 1830s, Frederick was back in Baltimore, working on the docks, and permitted to hire his own time, keeping a portion of his wages while handing the rest to Huald. This arrangement gave him movement and access to the free black community of the city. It was here that he met Anna Murray, the daughter of formerly enslaved parents, now herself a free woman working as a domestic servant. She was steady, capable, and fully committed to his cause. She believed in him when belief required courage. Together, they planned his escape. A first attempt, organized on the Eastern Shore with other enslaved men, had been betrayed before it began, and Frederick had been imprisoned. This time, the plan was simpler and quieter. 1 man, 1 day, 1 train north, 1 borrowed story. Anna sold her featherbed and contributed her savings to fund the journey. She obtained the protection papers of a free black sailor and sewed Frederick a sailor's uniform. Modest materials, enormous stakes. On the morning of 3 September 1838, Frederick Bailey walked to the Baltimore train station dressed as a sailor, papers in hand, and did not look back. Chapter 7. The Journey to Freedom. The journey north was 24 hours of controlled terror. Frederick rode the train from Baltimore to Wilmington, Delaware, then boarded a steamboat to Philadelphia, then another train to New York City. He carried borrowed sailors' protection papers and the borrowed story of being a free seaman. Several times he came close to discovery. He recognized men on the train who knew him. A conductor checked the papers without looking too closely. He kept his face steady and his breathing even. He arrived in New York City in the early hours of 4 September 1838, legally free only so long as he remained in a free state. With no money, no job, and every reason to fear the slave catchers who worked the northern cities. A sympathetic black sailor took him to the home of David Ruggles, a black abolitionist who sheltered freedom seekers. Frederick sent word to Anna Murray. She came north immediately. They were married on 15 September 1838. They chose their new surname together, Douglass, from the hero of a novel by Sir Walter Scott, a man who had lived free and unbroken in wild country. It was a beginning. From nothing recognized by law or custom, they made a life. Chapter 8. New Bedford and the Voice Discovered. Frederick and Anna Douglass settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a prosperous whaling port with a strong free black community and deep abolitionist networks. Frederick found work on the docks. Though white trade unions barred black workers from the skilled caulking trade, he had mastered in Baltimore. So he took whatever labor was offered, sawing wood, shoveling coal, driving a cart. He subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and read every issue. He attended meetings of the local anti-slavery society. In August 1841, at an abolitionist gathering on Nantucket Island, an organizer asked if any formerly enslaved person present would speak. Frederick stood. He told his story plainly, without notes. His baritone voice filled the hall. The audience was electrified. Garrison himself rose afterwards and asked the room, had they been listening to a thing, a piece of property, or to a man? The answer was obvious to everyone in that room. Garrison offered Douglass a paid position as a traveling speaker for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass accepted. He was 23 years old. He had been free for 3 years. He had the voice, the story, and now the stage. His life as the foremost orator of his generation had begun. Chapter 9. The Narrative of 1845. For 3 years, Douglass toured the northern states to audiences who were skeptical until they heard him. And then, as he noted with dry precision, doubted his story because he spoke too well to have been enslaved. In 1845, to silence the doubt with evidence, he wrote and published the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. He named names, the farms, the enslavers, the precise geography of his captivity. He described beatings with clinical detail. He wrote about learning to read with plain, devastating moral force. The book was 125 pages long. Within 4 months, it had sold approximately 4,500 copies. Within a few years, around 30,000 copies across the United States and Britain, with translations into French and Dutch. It was not merely a memoir. It was a piece of evidence placed before the world. This is what slavery is in one man's body and mind, in specific places that still exist. And it was written with a literary power that no one who had expected a rough account could dismiss. It remains, nearly 2 centuries later, one of the central works of American literature. Its author now had a problem. He had named his enslavers. In the United States, he was once again in legal danger of recapture. Chapter 10. Britain and Ireland, a free man abroad. Friends persuaded Douglass to sail for Britain and Ireland in August 1845, both to lecture and to place himself beyond the reach of American fugitive slave law. He arrived in Ireland first and was struck by the warmth of his welcome and by the grinding poverty of the Irish poor, which moved him to reflect on oppression in its many forms. He toured Scotland and England through 1845 and into 1846, speaking to packed halls. In Britain, he encountered something new, social circles that treated him without qualification, as an intellectual equal. He wrote home that he was being treated not as a color, but as a man. A group of British abolitionists raised the funds to purchase his legal freedom from Hugh Auld, approximately £150, so that he could return to America without fear of seizure. Douglass accepted, though the transaction troubled him and, he said so publicly, the idea that a man's freedom could be bought implied it was something to be sold. He returned to the United States in April 1847, legally free, internationally known, and carrying British friends' funds intended for a new purpose. He had arrived in Britain as an escaped slave running from the law. He was leaving as a free man with a plan. Chapter 11. The North Star. Against the advice of Garrison, who believed a black-run abolitionist newspaper would split the movement and drain readers from his own Liberator, Douglass moved to Rochester, New York, and, in December 1840, Seven published the first issue of the North Star. The name was precise. The North Star had been the navigational constant by which freedom seekers found their way. The masthead read, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Douglass funded the paper partly from his British lecture earnings and ran it for 16 years through various title changes, eventually becoming Frederick Douglass's paper. It was a serious journal, long on argument, rigorous on politics, committed to examining every dimension of the slavery question and the rights of free Black Americans in the North. Rochester was a good choice, a city with strong abolitionist networks near the Canadian border, on routes of the Underground Railroad. Anna Douglass made their home a way station for freedom, seekers heading north. By founding the North Star, Douglass was no longer speaking for another man's movement. He was building his own. Chapter 12. Breaking with Garrison, Women's Rights. The years around 1848 to 1851 brought two defining turns. At the Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848, the founding gathering of the American women's rights movement, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Douglass was the only African American present, and one of the few men willing to support Stanton's most contentious resolution that women should have the vote. He argued for it on the convention floor with the same force that had moved anti-slavery audiences for years. The resolution passed. He published his support in the North Star the following week. The second turn was away from Garrison. By 1851, Douglass had come to disagree with him on two fundamental questions: whether the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass concluded it was not properly read, and whether political action, voting, legislation, elections, could and should be used against slavery. Garrison said no to both. Douglass said yes. The rupture was bitter and personal, and it cost Douglass friendships. Intellectually, however, he had moved to the ground on which American abolition would ultimately win. Not by standing outside the political system and condemning it, but by entering it and forcing it to change. Chapter 13. What to the Slave is the 4th of July. On 5 July 1852, Douglass delivered what many consider the greatest speech in American history. The Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society had invited him to speak on Independence Day. He appeared the day after and answered a question most of his audience had never considered. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? The speech lasted nearly 2 hours. It moved through irony, moral philosophy, constitutional argument, and direct denunciation. He did not soften the charge or spare the audience their complicity. The nation, he said, was false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Yet the speech ended in hope, not despair. He argued that the Constitution, read honestly, was on the side of freedom, and that the Republic could still become what it claimed to be. Thousands of copies were printed and distributed. The speech remains one of the central texts of American political thought and literature, a demonstration of what oratory achieves when a first-rate mind is placed entirely in the service of justice, with nothing left to lose. Chapter 14. John Brown's Shadow. Through the 1850s, Douglass's relationship with John Brown, the white abolitionist who believed slavery could only end through violence, grew in influence and danger. They first met in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1847, and Brown's absolute conviction made a deep impression even on a man committed to political means. They stayed in contact across the decade, with Brown sharing increasingly specific plans. When Brown finally struck, his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in October 1859, intended to spark an armed uprising. Douglass was not there. He had declined to join, convinced the raid would fail, and that its failure would be used to crush the entire movement. He was right on both counts. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. Virginia then issued a warrant for Douglass's arrest as a co-conspirator. He had met with Brown shortly before the raid. Douglass fled to Canada and then to Britain, spending several months abroad before political circumstances allowed him to return. The episode showed the tightrope he always walked, a man of words and arguments in an age that was moving, inexorably, toward the one argument that settled everything: war. Chapter 15. War and the Question of Emancipation. Tanda chi. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Douglass saw immediately what Lincoln initially refused to say aloud: that the war was about slavery, and that it could not be won without making emancipation its explicit purpose. Lincoln spent the first 18 months insisting the war was only about preserving the Union, and that he would not touch slavery where it existed. Douglass argued publicly, in his newspaper, and from every platform he could reach, that this was both morally wrong and militarily foolish, that the Confederate South's enslaved labor was its great war advantage, and that arming and freeing black men was the decisive act that could shorten the conflict. He pressed for black soldiers. He called for emancipation by presidential order. He was impatient, relentless, and often furious. Then, in September 1862, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On 1 January 1863, it took effect, declaring enslaved people in the Confederate States legally free. Douglass stood in a Boston hall that night, waiting for the telegraph confirmation. When the news arrived, the room erupted. He later called it the most joyous moment of his life. It was not complete freedom. It exempted the border states, but it permanently changed the war's meaning. Chapter 16. Men of Color to Arms. In March 1863, Douglass published Men of Color to Arms, and threw himself into recruiting black soldiers for the Union Army. He helped fill the ranks of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black combat units, into which his sons Lewis and Charles both enlisted. He was proud, and he was angry. Black soldiers faced worse than battlefield death. The Confederate government declared it would not treat captured black Union soldiers as prisoners of war, but would re-enslave them or execute their white officers. Douglass demanded Lincoln respond. In August 1863, he walked into the White House, the first black American to meet a sitting president in an official capacity, and pressed Lincoln for equal pay, equal treatment of prisoners, and the right of black soldiers to hold commissions. Lincoln listened, spoke honestly about the limits of what he could do quickly, and invited Douglass back. They met again in August 1864, and once more after Lincoln's second inauguration in early 1865. Douglass came to regard him as a man who moved when the country was ready to be moved, never as fast as justice required, but in the end, far enough. Chapter 17. After the War, Reconstruction and its Betrayal. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in December 1865. The 14th granted black Americans citizenship in 1868. The 15th, in 1870, gave black men the vote. For a few years, Reconstruction offered something unprecedented in American history: black men elected to Congress, serving as judges and sheriffs, rebuilding the South as full citizens. Douglass spoke and wrote in vigorous support of this transformation, and settled in Washington, D.C. in 1872, closer to the centers of power. He was appointed president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, an institution that collapsed in 1874, losing the savings of tens of thousands of black depositors through mismanagement he had not caused but felt keenly. In 1877, President Hayes appointed him Marshal for the District of Columbia, the first black American to hold a federal marshal's post. But Reconstruction was collapsing around him. Southern states stripped black citizens of their rights through violence, fraud, and law. Federal support was withdrawn as part of the political compromise that ended Reconstruction in 1877. The constitutional promises of the post-war amendments were being dismantled, state by state, in full view of the federal government. Douglass continued to speak and write against it with everything he had. The era was turning against him, but he did not stop. Chapter 18. The Elder Statesman. By the 1880s, Douglass was in his 60s, nationally recognized, and still working. He had purchased Cedar Hill, a handsome estate in Anacostia overlooking Washington, D.C., with the earnings of a lifetime of writing and lecturing, a black man who owned his home, his land, and his name. Anna Murray Douglass died in 1882 after 44 years of marriage. In 1884, he married Helen Pitts, a white reformer and fellow abolitionist, provoking a storm of criticism from black and white communities alike. He was unapologetic. In 1889, President Harrison appointed him U.S. Minister to Haiti, where he served 2 years before resigning over disagreements with the administration's approach to Haitian sovereignty. He continued to write, publishing a third, expanded autobiography, and to speak out against the epidemic of lynching accelerating across the South. He had lived to see the end of slavery, the promise of Reconstruction, and the systematic breaking of that promise. He saw the beginnings of the movement that would not triumph until the century after his death. He lectured, he published, he argued, he did not become quiet. The fire that Covey could not extinguish, that the law had tried to contain, that the ocean crossing had not doused. It was still burning, 60 years on. Chapter 19, February 20, 1895. On the evening of 20 February 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., spending the day with Susan B., Anthony, and others still fighting for rights not yet won. He returned to Cedar Hill that evening. Shortly after supper, he collapsed in the front hallway and died of a heart attack. He was approximately 77 years old. Grief crossed racial lines in ways American public life rarely allowed. He lay in state in City Hall in Rochester, the city of the North Star, and schools, churches, and legislatures passed resolutions. He had lived the full arc from enslaved child on a Maryland Creek bank to the most documented black man of his century. 3 autobiographies, thousands of published speeches, and more than 160 photographs he posed for deliberately. Understanding that a dignified black face looking steadily from a portrait was itself a political act. He posed for every one of them with the same expression: serious, composed, undefeated. From the first daguerreotype in 1841 to the final portrait made months before his death. The same face from first to last. Chapter 20. What we really know. Frederick Douglass left behind more documentation of himself than almost any American of his century. 3 autobiographies, hundreds of published speeches and editorials, thousands of letters, and more than 160 photographs he posed for deliberately, understanding that images of a dignified black man were themselves a form of argument. The broad arc of his life is firmly established. Some details remain uncertain. His exact birth date, he chose February 14 himself. The identity of his father, he believed it was his enslaver, but could not prove it. Historians now recognize that Anna Murray's contribution to his escape, the uniform, the borrowed papers, the funds, was greater than older accounts admitted. His break with Garrison was ideological and personal. His views on women's suffrage grew more complicated after 1869, when he argued black men's need for the franchise was more urgent and was criticized for it. He was not a simple monument. He was a man who changed, argued, was sometimes wrong, and kept going. What is not disputed, he emerged from conditions designed to make resistance impossible, built a public life of extraordinary scope, and spent 53 years of freedom making noise on behalf of everyone the Republic had not yet included. He started with nothing the world recognized as his. He built everything from there, a note on history and sources. The story in this book is grounded in documented historical sources. Frederick Douglass is unusually well evidenced for a 19th century figure. He published 3 autobiographies, thousands of newspaper editorials and speeches, and posed for more than 160 surviving photographs. The broad arc of his life, the enslavement, the self-education, the escape, the career as an orator and editor, the meetings with Lincoln, the government appointments, is firmly established by primary sources. Where uncertainty exists, this book says so. His birth year is generally accepted as around 1818, but the exact date is not documented. He chose 14 February himself. The identity of his father is unknown. He believed it was his enslaver, but could not prove it. Anna Murray's contribution to his escape, the uniform, the borrowed sailor's protection papers, and the funds, was long underemphasized in older accounts that centered Douglass alone. Modern scholarship, including Rosetta Douglass Sprague's memoir of her mother, makes clear how central Anna Murray was. This book reflects that correction. The confrontation with Edward Covey, the escape journey, and the inner experiences described in this book draw on Douglass's own accounts in his narrative 1845, and later, autobiographies. These are primary sources of great literary and historical value, and like all memoirs, they are also shaped by memory, craft, and the author's purposes. Readers interested in going further are encouraged to read the narrative itself, which is freely available in many editions. The illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. They are not photographs, historical portraits, or documentary depictions of real people or events. Extensive real photographic portraits of Frederick Douglass, more than 160 of them, are held by institutions, including the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Portrait Gallery. Readers are strongly encouraged to seek them out. About Griot. Griot tells the true stories of African and Black history with the care they deserve, researched, sourced, and beautifully illustrated. If you enjoyed this book, look out for more in the series. Copyright 2026. Published independently via Griot.